Hi, everybody. This is AI with Dr. Craig Hansen. I'm delighted to have Dr. David Goldberg with us, who's coming to us live from America. Good to see you.
Hey, it's great to be with you, Craig, and I appreciate you running the show about what AI means to us now.
Thank you. It's really interesting watching your TED talk that you did about creating a different way of education for engineering. And I really liked that. That was a great one. And I looked at your website as well and your field manual for creating change in education as well. I loved seeing that. I learned a lot from looking through your website. I'd love for you to share with us your backstory, the origin story of where you came to be, how you came to be today.
Sure. Yeah. So, well, and I there's a long version of that. I'll do the short version of it. But back in the back in the 70s, I graduated with a civil engineering degree in hydraulics and a master's degree, and went out into the world and um, I was doing software for pipeline fluid flows. And one thing led to another, and I decided to go back to get a PhD because I had read Doug Hofstadter's book, Gödel, Escher, and Bach, which inspired a lot of people to go back and do AI. So I go back to school to do AI. I sign up for the AI class. I'm in civil engineering, but I sign up in CS for the AI class that they offered then, and it was canceled. So all my hopes and dreams of be doing something in AI were kind of went up in smoke. And I said, oh my God, I got to do something. So I went looking through the catalog, and I found a class called Introduction to Adaptive Systems by a guy named John Holland. Well, it turns out that later John Holland became famous for his work in a kind of AI known as genetic algorithms. And my dissertation ended up being one of the first engineering dissertations applying genetic algorithms in both optimizing, in this case, gas pipeline systems, as well as operating them using what we would now view as a fairly primitive machine learning system. This is back in 1983.
Wow.
So that's how I got into AI, and looking for a job. I looked for pipeline jobs. I looked for AI jobs. AI won out, and I ended up being a researcher in various engineering departments at the University of Alabama and then the University of Illinois, studying both the application and the science of how genetic algorithms worked. In the 80s, I wrote a book called Genetic Algorithms and Search Optimization and Machine Learning. I think it's still one of the most highly cited books in AI ever. It's got over 100,000 citations, and I had no idea. And I was told not to write it because assistant professors don't write books. So anyway, that's the backstory. But in terms of what we might talk about, there's a kind of got to roll forward in time a little bit. So I'm sitting in a coffee shop with one of my colleagues, Andreas Kangalaris, and we're talking about innovation, and he says, we need to teach young engineers this stuff. I said, well, I couldn't agree more. He said, well, I'm going to go to the dean. He goes to the dean, he comes back all excited. The dean's going to appoint us to help him write a charge for a committee that will help change engineering education. And I got upset. I got pissed off about it. I said, I am too old to be on yet another committee that doesn't actually do something.
Right.
So, and Andreas thought he had lost me, but I went back and I said, okay, I came back and I said, look, let's create an incubator for change. Let's actually do a grassroots effort and actually try to make change. So we created something called the Illinois Foundry for Innovation in Engineering Education, which later became a college activity with a small amount of sponsorship from our dean, but that went on to actually nudge the culture at the time was a university that was not interested in doing much in the undergraduate level. And Illinois always had a strong reputation in research, and the idea that serious professors would spend much of their time on how engineering education conducts itself kind of made you unserious at the time. But we nudged the culture, and now actually people do spend their time thinking about those things. And And so that's the deeper backstory of how a nice artificial intelligence researcher ended up being kind of an educational reformist.
And do you think that AI, are you noticing and seeing the change, discussion, conversations? Do you think that it's going to have a significant impact, or do you think it's going to be just a modification of business as usual?
Yeah, I think it's, well, first of all, um, I'm interested in the future, but I don't think of myself as being particularly good at prognosticating the future. I've been wrong enough about what the future brought in mind that I um, have to be modest in those ways. I've written some articles of trying to struggle with how to think about what's going on. So I did an article for Professional Engineers magazine here in the States on thinking about another time when transformative change came along. It's not exactly the same thing, and that actually sometimes analogies are good for similarities and differences. But I was thinking about early in my education in the 70s, I walked into class with a slide rule. And this was in 71. In 72, Hewlett Packard introduced the HP 35 scientific calculator, which upended all of how engineers calculated anything. Now, that seems like a small thing now, and we take it for granted with $15 Casio calculators that graph and do backflips and things. So it's hard to think about that as
Mm,
disruptive as it was, but it was. And
mm,
people were worried about people having an advantage and getting ahead. You know, the fact that someone could afford a $700 calculator, and $700 was a lot of money in 1971,
mm,
70. Um, people really worried about it, and they worried that there would be things lost, and there were things lost. I think that being trained in that era, I have a good sense of number, whereas people trained post calculator kind of garbage in, garbage out, and they don't, you know, when you have to add the mantisses in doing calculations with scientific notation because you don't have a device that handles it for you, you kind of get a sense of magnitudes, and you get a sense of, is this number meaningful or right, or how many, and of course now engineers think too much of the precision in the computer calculations give them 10 significant figures, only 2 or 3 of which actually mean anything.
right.
But back in the day, we could only do 2 or 3, and so we paid attention to it. So I've been trying to think about AI in that sense. Of course, AI is bigger than that. AI is sort of doing to um, all things theoretical what scientific calculators did to numerical computation. And
Mm,
so that's a bigger thing than than the disruption of calculators. So I think it is more disruptive, but I also don't think that we need, you know, that we don't need to be Chicken Little and the sky is falling about it. If we think about, if we think um, careful, I think there are also opportunities. When we didn't have to do calculations like that on a slide rule, that opened the possibility for us doing other things. And so I think there's the possibility that AI opens the door to us doing things that we have not done, that maybe we should have done.
mm. Looking through your field manual that you have on your website, you mentioned the 3 practices of curious listening, the keystone habit of
Yes.
great educational cultures. Could you share some more about that?
Yeah, and I think, and actually, I think that's one of, I think that's I'm glad you focused on that, because I think that's one of the big ones. Um, you know, engineers are known for their expertise, and we're telling people how to do things, but great practice, great engineering practice has always been about great listening and great interaction. So engineers, good engineering is going on when engineers are sitting at a table drawing little sketches to each other, and then, no, it's not, it's like this, no, it's like this. having a conversation. So great practice has always been conversational, but because there's so much stuff in the engineering curriculum, we don't really ever get to talking to young engineers about what does it mean to be a great listener, a great conversationalist, a great
Mm,
practitioner, in the sense of having this rich interchange that comes in great practice. Um, and so when I left the university in 2010, I retired early to start my company, Three Joy, to go out in the world and help people change both engineering and higher education. I took training as a leadership coach, and like day one in leadership coaching school, it's all about listening. In fact, there's a funny say, the first day of class, we're in there, I'm with 35 other coaches, and they we introduce each, we had a check-in, and then the teacher coach says, well, okay, what do you notice? And I don't know, I had a terrible reaction to that question. I mean, what do you mean, what do I notice? I just spent five figures to come to this. I want to learn some coaching school skills. But I realized, after I went through the program and after I realized what coaching was and what they were really teaching us, that they were teaching us really basic stuff about human communication. I said, oh my
mm,
goodness, that was a really good question. What do I notice? And
mm,
to be a good coach is to notice, but to be a good practitioner in any professional field is to be a good noticer. And so
mm,
it seems to me that AI could open, if we spend the time that it gives us wisely,
mm,
uh, the door to us being to teaching people not and young engineers and young professionals, computer science professionals, whatever, will still need to learn the basics of whatever technical trade they're in, and they shouldn't rely, as someone using a scientific calculator shouldn't rely on the garbage out coming out of their systems as being correct. It is still the responsibility of the human in charge to
right.
decide whether what's coming out of Chat GPT, engineer, or whatever, to decide whether that thing coming out is sensible. But it might open the door to um, us actually getting to the roots of what constitutes the the what constitutes deep practice, as opposed to the assumption that we've made for a long time that engineering practice, computer science practice, is about the application of well-vetted theory to particular situations.
Mm. So it's noticing one of the three curious practices.
Well, so so you asked particularly about um, so in the chat, yeah. So in the chapter on curious listening, I think I talk about noticing, listening, and questioning,
Right.
and so in that way, and we use the acronym in Three Joy NLQ, but the kind of awareness of what's going on, kind of listening to understand what someone really means, as opposed to listening to speak, or listening to
Mm,
talk, or listening to tell you. A lot of listening is I listen to tell you what you just said means to me, as opposed to listening to you to try to understand what it means to you.
right.
And both kinds are good kinds of listening, but sometimes we're better at one kind than another. And then powerful questions. How do we ask? A lot of times we ask questions to get information. Those are fine, but how do we ask questions that get people to reflect fairly deeply
Mm,
about what the problem is, or what the solution might be, at a non-superficial level? So in coaching,
mm,
sometimes those are called powerful questions.
mm. I'm reflecting while you're talking and thinking, how can I ask better questions when I'm speaking with principals to understand really what are the drivers that are going to help them get where they want to be, so that we can you really meet the needs of learners. Equity is the big thing that I think that AI, if used correctly and planned well, can really increase equity and opportunity and give teachers more time to do what they're best at, which is building relationship with students so that they can then go on that learning journey together.
Well, and there's a coach's trick. It's like, and sometimes I think some of my fellow coaches get mad at me when I share it because it's like a magician telling their tricks. Um, but one of the ways to ask more powerful questions more of the time is to begin your questions with the word what.
Mm,
So sometimes when we ask how, that ends up with a pedestrian discussion of process. Sometimes when we ask why, people can get defensive because they think they need to give a reason for what they did previously. But a
mm,
lot of times both process questions and explanatory questions that are seeking explanations, you start with what. It's much more expansive and there's no one right answer. And so,
mm,
like when I'm in a coaching conversation with a client, a lot of my questions will begin with what, and sometimes there'll be a pause, but because someone pauses in answering a question doesn't mean that it's a bad question. It sometimes means it was a very good question.
mm. Yeah, that's great. I'm curious about why you named your company Three Joy.
Hmm. Yeah, so that goes back to the Illinois Foundry for Innovation and Engineering Education, and we use we talked about the three joys: the joy of engineering, the joy of learning, and the joy of community.
Mm,
And so when I when I left the university in 2010, and it's hard to believe that it's been 14 years, but when I left the university in 2010, I was thinking about, well, what will I name this company? And it seemed like um, that was a good name, and it still sticks. Sometimes I get weird messages from China about companies wanting to use the name for things that look a little spurious and strange, but for the most part, it's been a great name for the company.
yeah. I realized as soon as I said it, I should have said what and asked the question with what.
Well, and again, there's no right or wrong about questions, but it's fun to actually try that as a
Mm,
practice and to see if it elicits different. You can sort of just ordinary conversations, if you can kind of practice shifting to what, it's actually interesting to see whether um, the conversation goes deeper. When I come into schools and help them try to make change, one of the key things that we do is we work on curious listening as a base infrastructure skill,
mm,
because really, universities are tough places to make change. You have first everyone's really smart. They all got they all got advanced degrees of some sort or another, and many times I remember seeing this cartoon once about, that had these little cartoon bubbles. I'm the smartest guy in the room. No, I'm the smartest guy in the room. And so there's the sense that there's a lot of ego. And so part of being able to have conversation is to get people to listen to each other about what different people think. And so oftentimes we'll start with some exercises, many of the same exercises that would we would have in a class for coaches, but now with the aim of getting people to have deeper conversations about uh, what an education should be. And then the best of those are when we can actually bring students into those conversations and hear what they
mm.
think.
Yeah, great. Dave, just as we wrap up, what's the best way for people to get hold of you to engage you with your services?
Yeah, so go take a look at my website, 3joy.com, or seek me out on LinkedIn, linkedin.com/IN/DEG 511, my initials Delta Echo Golf 511, or send me an email at deg@3joy.com. Happy to hear
Awesome.
from any of your listeners.
Thank you. Really appreciate your time, Dave.
You bet, Craig. Thanks for having me on the show.